So today we're going to start talking about the Constitution. The Constitution is one of the founding documents, of course, of America, and it's intrinsically involved in American history. And of course, we talked about before, the course is titled U.S. History and Constitution. So this is going to be the first of sort of a series of lessons that focus particularly on the Constitution, how it came about, and the structure of our government, because that's very important. So if you had a government class, this should be sort of a review. If you haven't, then you may just need to spend a little bit more time here. Now, of course, in the last lesson that you watched, we were talking about the Declaration of Independence. So you can sort of see this as a jump ahead to the end of the war. So the American Revolution, you've learned a lot about in middle school or elementary school, George Washington, Battle of Saratoga, the forging of Valley Forge. All of that is sort of a rabbit trail for this particular course. It's interesting and definitely good to know, but you don't need to focus on that for this course. We want to focus on the documents and the development of our government after the war. So don't get caught up in the American Revolution for this course. There are a lot of documents that we talk about, and students tend to get them confused. Declaration of Independence, Articles of the Confederation, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. You need to know what these four documents are and what they did. Of course, in the last lesson, we talked about the Declaration of Independence, breaking away from England, laying out those grievances against the king, and uniting those people in the colonies that weren't on board yet. So let's look at these last three. The Articles of the Confederation, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And we'll do them in order. So the Articles of the Confederation. After the American Revolution, you have all of these different colonies or these different states, and you have to pull them together as a nation, right? So the Articles of the Confederation is the first document that's going to bring all of the states together. It's going to be the first government of the United States, so don't get that confused with the Constitution. There was something that came before it. Now, we know that the American Revolution was fought to preserve their state legislatures, right? They were upset because Britain was taxing them and not letting their own state parliaments do the taxing. So the Articles of the Confederation, of course, made very strong state governments because each state had their own legislature, had their own parliament. And so with the Articles of the Confederation, they wanted to preserve that. Of course, this was very good when they had a common goal, when all of the states were working together to defeat England. It didn't really matter that they had all of these different, each state had a different legislature. But when the war is over, we see the states getting to act more like individual city-states and not as a united states, because the Articles of the Confederation were very weak and supported strong state governments. So they began creating their own state laws. So what are some of those problems? Well, states began to print their own money. So South Carolina might have a currency and Virginia might have a currency. They had no control over interstate trade. So if South Carolina could say, well, I'm going to charge an import tax to Virginia, right? Because it's interstate. So the articles could not control trade between the different states. With the weaknesses of the Articles of the Confederation, the states began trading individually with foreign countries. So if England wanted to trade, they wouldn't trade with the United States. They may trade with just South Carolina or Virginia. But of course, since they're so weak, they couldn't have an army, a standing army, so the states began developing their own militias. So you can definitely see that this is a serious problem. So the national government that did exist underneath the Articles of the Confederation was very weak. It could not tax, it could not raise money for an army, it couldn't work with foreign powers. There really was no executive branch and no judicial branch. So if you're going to point out some of these special weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, you definitely want to focus on the economy, right? It was not good for each state to be trading independently and working sort of against itself when it came to interstate trade. They were putting tariffs on imported and exported goods. So the fundamental problem that we have with the Articles of the Confederation is if the states don't acknowledge a central power, how can a central power enforce or do anything as a nation? That's your central power. That's your central problem. You do want to remember the one good thing that did come out of the Articles of the Confederation. You need to know about the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance basically established a way for new states to be created. Because remember, we're just a baby. We've only got these 13 colonies, and we're going to want to expand. And we have to know how that's going to happen. And it set the precedent of allowing states to come in on equal footing. So the Northwest Ordinance said that when a new state was created, it had the same rights and protections as all the other states. So it wasn't like, oh, you develop a new state and you only get certain rights. You came in as an equal participant. It also did something that we're going to face pretty soon is, of course, the issue of slavery, and it declared slavery illegal in the Northwest Territory, and that's this pink portion right here, up through here. This is your Northwest Territory, and that's important because we're going to start really seeing this divide between states that want slavery and states that don't. So why is this important? Well, under the Articles of the Confederation, states had strong governments, right? There was states' rights, basically, and we're going to see that coming up again and again. What is the role of the federal government versus the role of the states? The Constitution is going to be what brings the states together. It's going to try to create a strong federal government. And we debate that even today. Well, what is the role of the federal government versus the role of the state? So we're trying to sort that out with the Constitution because we realize that the Articles of the Confederation are just too weak. So according to President Franklin Roosevelt, he said, like the Bible, it ought to be read again and again. Henry Clay said it was made not merely for the generation that existed, but for posterity, unlimited, undefined, endless, perpetual posterity. And Justice Hugo Black carried one with him virtually all the time. So you see that the Constitution is written as a living document that's going to change as the country changes, and it's going to address central issues that we even still struggle with today. So what did it do? The Constitution established a federal system. It's going to establish the three branches of government, which are the executive, judicial, and legislative. And it's going to establish this principle of checks and balances and separations of power. So these are the things that we're going to focus on and the things that you need to know for this class. So what is a federal system? And that's the first thing that they're going to try to hammer out in the Constitution. The federal system is when the government shares power with the states, right? So here, this is a picture of the White House. That's going to be your federal government. So certain powers are going to be designated for the federal government, but not exclusively. Because remember, they fought a war to get away from one central power. So they're going to share power with the states. And of course, this is our state capital, right? So if you've ever been to Columbia, you can go in and you can see our state government working. And that's what a federal system is. It divides power between the federal government and then the individual states. And of course, we debate this, and we're going to look at this over and over again. What is the role of the federal government? What is the role of the states? And who has more power? This is separation of powers. Don't get those confused. You may see questions on the end of course exam to help test your knowledge on this that look like this. George Mason wrote in 1787 that the purse and the sword must not be in the same hands. Which principle in the U.S. Constitution best reflects the concern expressed in this quotation? So you have to think about, and that's a lot of the questions make you think, okay, well, what is purse? That's the ability to tax. So we want one branch to tax. And the sword, and that's the army, of course. So we want the sword and the army to be separate. So which one of these would you pick? And of course, that's separation of powers. So when we were let's go back to our picture of the three branches divided up. And if you look at the legislative branch, this is the branch that's going to make the laws. So they decided that they needed to divide this up even further. You may have noticed that underneath this branch, you have Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. So we want to look at this right here. We want to look at Congress. Because the question became, how do the states get represented in that legislative branch, right? So how does South Carolina, how many people are going to go to the national government? Is it going to be 1? Is it going to be 10? Is Virginia going to get more representatives than us? What is that going to look like? And there were two ideas. You had the Virginia plan, and the Virginia plan was for the big states because Virginia at the time, of course, was the bigger state, and they said, well, we'll do it based on population, right? Because, you know, if your state's big, you can fit a lot of people in a big state versus a small state like New Jersey, if just by land mass, they are not going to be able to hold as many people. Again, because you have to think back to when this was created. They said we'll take a census every 10 years, and then based upon that census, that's how many people will go to the national federal government, right? The New Jersey plan was for small states. It said, no, that's not fair. We will never have as many people in New Jersey as Virginia, so we want it to be equal. Every state will get 2 people, no matter how big or how small. So what did we do? We combined them because unlike right now, back then, we were able to work together and we were able to compromise. And that gave us the Senate. And the Senate has 2 senators for every state. And the House of Representatives is based on population. So, for example, South Carolina has 8 House members. California has 55. So when people are voting on laws, 55 people from California can vote on it versus the 8 from South Carolina because we don't have as many people. If you've ever been to Washington and seen the Congress, you know that it's a really big room because you've got to fit all of those people in it. So of course that brings up another problem, another question. Who counts as a person? Slaves. South Carolina wanted to count slaves because we had a lot of them. Of course, northern states who were slowly emancipating their slaves realized that if the South were to count slaves, they would have more people, right? The House is based on population. So again, we compromised. The 3/5 compromise said that for every 5 slaves, you got 3 votes, or they counted as 3/5 of a person. So even though this is a terrible thing to say that, you know, a slave's not worth 1 vote, and they're not really legitimately people, it was better than nothing, and it definitely satisfied the South. Of course, we're just going to come back to haunt us when we head into the Civil War. Even with all of this compromise, we're still going to have people that liked the Constitution and people who didn't. And you need to remember that the people who liked the Constitution were called Federalists, and people who didn't were called Anti-Federalists. So Federalists, of course, for the federal government, supported the Constitution. They believed in a strong federal government. They wanted a big government. Anti, which means against, would be small government, and they're going to be the ones that support states' rights. So again, how did we compromise and come together? We did that with the Bill of Rights, and this is the last document that you need to be familiar with and not get confused. The Bill of Rights is going to be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution lays out the framework of government. It says this is what the executive branch does, this is how it's checked and balanced. It describes that process. The Bill of Rights is different. The Bill of Rights basically says you are born with these rights and the government cannot take them away from you. So no matter how big the government gets, you have these rights. And we're going to see this again and again throughout history, so it's important to know what they are. This, of course, goes back to, if you think back to the English Bill of Rights, which guaranteed Englishmen that they had certain rights that could not be taken away. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's Amendment 1. So Amendment 1 has a lot of stuff in it, right? It's telling us that the government can't take away your freedom of speech. It can't take away your freedom to gather together. And it's important to note because we're going to see freedom marches, right, during the Civil Rights Movement. Or we're going to see later on when people start on television and television comes in and they start saying all of this stuff, maybe against a candidate, they can't take that away from them. That falls under free speech. So Amendment 1 covers a lot of information, and you do need to be familiar with what is in Amendment 1. So you've got 9 more. You should read them and be familiar with them, but I'm not going to list all of them. So Amendment 2 would be no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So, of course, that's going back to the Quartering Act, where England was putting soldiers in people's houses. And this is making sure that, the government doesn't have a right to make you take in soldiers. Make sure that you understand that there were 10 of them, and then focus on the first one, because that's going to come up again and again in history. All right, that is the discussion of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Articles of Confederation. So make sure that you don't get those documents confused and that you understand the basic framework of government. See you next time.